I'm delighted to be here this evening to chair the 2017 Forgiveness Project lecture. This lecture will be given by Richard Holloway, one of our greatest thinkers and discursants in British political life. He will speak to us about the politics of forgiveness.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming this evening to the Forgiveness Project annual lecture. I'm absolutely delighted that Richard Holloway is here to give the lecture on the politics of forgiveness, and that Shami Chakrabarti has agreed to chair this lecture. It's wonderful to have you both here. And thank you, all of you, for coming. I'll introduce them in a minute a little bit more, but I just want to say a word from me first of all. My name's Marina Cantacasino, and 14 years ago, I founded the Forgiveness Project, which is a charity that was born out of my own anger and frustration in the aftermath of the Iraq War. As a journalist at the time, I felt the only response that I had to the loud rhetoric of revenge and retaliation was to collect what I now call restorative narratives. So these were stories about forgiveness, about empathy, about recovery, and about restorative justice. And if those stories felt relevant then, they feel actually even more relevant now. We live in a time of extreme polarization of black and white politics, where a single tweet or a single statement seems to be able to fuel hatred, division, and insularity in a second. And I actually really believe that these stories can make a difference and build a world that is more hopeful, is safer, and more peaceful. And that's why we continue to do the work that we do. The Forgiveness Project is nearly 14 years old now. And we have collected, curated, and shared many stories over the years. This year alone, we launched the new F-Word exhibition at the Oxford Gallery, a whole new exhibition. We created and launched an online schools resource for teachers and students. We have a new website that's about to come out, and we continue to run the Restore Prison programme in prisons, both in the female and male estate. And what we do is we really look at the individual journey of transformation, but we recognise that these stories can't be viewed in a vacuum. And where these stories involved organisations or authority figures or governments and unsatisfactory accountability or justice systems, then the story becomes really complicated, actually, which is why I was delighted, not only that Richard Holloway agreed to give this lecture, but actually chose the subject of the politics of forgiveness. Richard is an author, a broadcaster, former Bishop of Edinburgh. He's one of my favourite contemporary thinkers. I love his books. I love what he says about doubt, about faith, about reconciling the pain of regret. Like me, he's suspicious of certainty, both theological and political certainty. And in 1998, over the gay bishop issue, he threw his mitre into the Thames, both literally and metaphorically, and has stood on the edge of... He's stood on the edge of religion, I would say, ever since. He calls himself an agnostic Christian. And I think he sits on the edge so that he can have a clear view in to the middle, but also so that he can embrace everything that lies beyond. It's also such an honour to have Shami Chakrabarti here to chair the lecture. She knows a lot about politics and justice. For many years, she was Director of Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties, and she's now Shadow Attorney General in Corbyn's shadow cabinet. So I'm going to hand over to Shami just to say a few words to introduce Richard, and then we'll continue. And I'll come on right at the end very, very briefly. But thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Well, thank you so much for that. What the world needs now is the Forgiveness Project. This one and all the other projects that we hope can come from this one in time. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to be here this evening and to have been asked to chair Richard. I have said that before. I have said that often, and my late mother taught me to say that, and I sometimes actually mean it. And tonight, I really mean it. So thank you, Rena, and thank you, Richard, for including me in what I'm sure is going to be a really special evening. Richard is one of the most important thinkers in the United Kingdom today. And it's wonderful that he's going to share his thoughts on the politics of forgiveness, and that we will be in fellowship and discussion and conversation together, because surely some of what we need is the ability to question and discuss and even disagree well. That's my hope anyway, and that's the way we're going to try and handle this evening. So our formal conversation will go on till just before 9 o'clock. To begin, Richard will deliver the 2017 Forgiveness Project lecture, and then I will be asking 4 project storytellers to ask the first questions. I may abuse the chair and ask a couple of questions before, but I won't abuse it too much, because the important thing is that the storytellers put their perspectives and questions, and then all of you have the opportunity to be in discussion with Richard. So without further ado, I give you the 2017 Forgiveness Project lecturer. Please give a warm, warm welcome to Richard Holloway.
Thank you for that very warm welcome, and it's an enormous honour to be invited to deliver this lecture. I want to begin at Harvard University in the late 60s. There was a young physics graduate called Thomas Kuhn, who was invited by the president of Harvard University to deliver a series of lectures on the history of science to humanities students. And in his research for the lecture series, Kuhn made what to him was an interesting discovery. He had assumed that science operated a bit like those coal mining machines that chew their way through a seam of coal. It's kind of horizontal, undramatic, non-interruptive, very noisy, but it just chews through facts. He discovered that it was in fact much more dramatic and interruptive than that, and he developed what he called paradigm theory to explain how it actually worked. A paradigm was a constellation of agreements among scientists, and it worked by absorbing new knowledge till finally challenged and overthrown, and it was followed by what he called a scientific revolution. And the classic example, of course, would be the overthrow of Ptolemaic or Aristotelian astronomy through the invention of telescopes and replaced by the Copernican paradigm. That's the way it worked, because scientists, a bit like priests, hold on to their orthodoxy very firmly. I think it was Kuhn himself who said that the single most important thing in the advancement of science is the death of scientists. And so you do get that sense of priesthoods and orthodoxies and doctrinal stuff that's got stuck doctrinally, and it takes a great jolt of energy to move it on. And he wrote a little book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. A very dense little book. I've read it twice and kind of understood it, but the point I'm coming to is that whether it was true or not about science, suddenly all other intellectual disciplines jumped on the idea. They suddenly discovered that they'd been doing paradigms as well and hadn't realized it, that everything came in paradigms. And a very good example of the cross-cultural impact of this little book was Hans Kung, the great Roman Catholic theologian, who has recently finished an enormous theological study called The Religious Situation of Our Times. He wrote a fat book on Judaism, a fat book on Christianity, and a fatter book on Islam. And in each of these books, he pointed out that these religions operated within paradigms. Usually 5, I think he's got a thing about that number, emerging into a 6th paradigm. He said that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, religions that claim to be unchanging, in fact, are in constant shift and turmoil. And those of us who've been in any of those religions know that to be the case. It seems to me that the piece of religious wisdom that captures this insight and applies it is the Jain parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant. The Jains are a wonderful Indian sect. They're totally non-violent. They believe in ahimsa, you don't do violence to anything, which means they tend to starve themselves to death because they only eat stuff that falls from trees. It's never really caught on as a universal doctrine. But the interesting thing about them is that they apply the doctrine of non-violence to ideas. And they tell this wonderful parable of the 6 blind men. The teacher tells them to feel a bit of the elephant. The elephant is reality, of course. It's the elephant in the universe. And they each come up with a different feel interpretation of it. And he says to them, you're all right, but none of you has the whole elephant because none of you can get the whole elephant. And the moral of that demonstration, and the point I'm reaching to, is that we each of us see things not as they are, but as we are. We see things from a particular perspective, but we tend to think that the bit of the elephant we've got hold of is ultimate reality, and it can make us very harsh and difficult people. Let me sum up what I've said so far with a few lines from Louis MacNeice. He said, each of us, this poem was called Mutations, and it, in a sense, summarizes the human condition. Each of us has known mutations in the mind when the world jumped and what had been a plan dissolved and rivers gushed from what had seemed a pool. We live in a time of the gushing of the paradigms, sometimes described as postmodernism, the main characteristic of which is that there's no prevailing paradigm or world view that's settled anywhere. We're no longer in a pool, we're in a river. And it's very disconcerting, it can be very bracing, because we know that while all world views are relative and provisional, holding on to one gave us a kind of stability, a base from which to see things. Our predicament is that our situation today can lead to moral immobilism and cultural relativism, making it difficult to challenge views we know are wrong, but somehow we're stuck where we are. So my first conclusion, I'll come to little mini climaxes throughout this lecture, and my first mini climax, my first conclusion is, we see things not as they are, but as we are. And this means we should recognize the limits of our knowledge and bring some humility and skepticism to all our thinking. And my first question is, how did we get here? If this even roughly describes the human condition at this time in the 21st century, how did it come to pass? I can detect 3 big influences, 3 big revolutions have contributed to our situation today. The transportation revolution has shrunk the world physically, and that can have a devastating effect. I moved with my family from Scotland to America in 1980. 1 minute we were in Edinburgh, where we'd lived and loved very happily, and in 6 hours we were in a completely different culture, settling to a completely new life. It was a devastating shock, and we endure these shocks all the time because of all the crisscrossing that goes on. The second big element in the situation that we find ourselves in is that market forces have not only globalized the economy, the very idea of the market has become a dominant metaphor for interpreting the human condition. But the most revolutionary element has been the 24/7 digitized news cycle amplified by the instancy of social media, which has brought everything and everyone up close all the time. This phenomenon has been described as the death of distance, and it has had a devastating effect on interpersonal relations, but I want to concentrate on its effect on institution and particularly political leadership. Distance used to lend enchantment. It endowed our leaders with the authority of necessary illusion, without which leadership is made difficult, if not impossible. Just think what would happen to Gladstone or Churchill today if they were the subject of 24/7 on all the time inclusive media. They wouldn't survive in today's vigilantly prurient and unforgiving culture. There's now a prevailing contempt for politicians and leaders of other important institutions, making it almost impossible to manage or lead with any kind of relaxed confidence. The result is a kind of institutional hypochondria. We're always morally x-raying public figures and the institutions they lead, then broadcasting the results to the scoffing multitude. A good example is the Prime Minister's speech last week. Every second of it was prurently displayed to us all. I felt sorry for the poor woman, and it must have been devastating for her. She must have wanted just to walk off the stage, maybe crawl off the stage, but she had to stand there knowing that this would be broadcast for hours and for weeks, and we would still be talking about it. Our predicament is that institutions are necessary to our social functioning, however flawed they are, but the death of distance has made institutional functioning unduly challenging. And the most dramatic example, I think, is in politics, resulting in the strange paradox of massive disillusionment with political leadership, allied to a naive longing for a messianic leader with a magic fix who will rescue us from ourselves and bring in the longed-for golden age. So I've come to my second mini-climax, my second conclusion. And this is the idea that beyond the current crisis, there is a calm pool, in McNeese's phrase, rather than the white water rapid we are always negotiating, is a delusion. Crisis is the norm. It is intrinsic to our nature. You could say that human nature is itself a crisis. We're in constant churn and turmoil within ourselves about how to react to pressures in our own lives, how to manage our own strange, ambivalent nature as semi-rational animals with passions and feelings and longings, and lots of dark bits in our consciousness, our psyche, we're not even in touch with. So my second question is, if crisis is the norm, if the white water rapid is where we human beings find ourselves, how should we manage it? How should we, as it were, engage and negotiate with each other if this is the way things now are? I think, first of all, we need to recapture a realist understanding of human nature and have the courage and compassion to apply it to our institutional life. Now, what do I mean by a realist understanding of human nature? In old theological language, we are fallen creatures born in a state of original sin. In the newer jargon of evolutionary psychology, we are creatures in a state of imperfect transitioning, what Aristotle described as animals who reason, hybrids who can neither entirely understand nor control their own natures, but have some capacity for self-reflection and self-examination. Interestingly, the man who developed this theory most trenchantly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian who happened to be Barack Obama's favorite theologian. Because it was this realist self-understanding that led slowly and painfully to the formation of representative democracy and systems of institutional government. We learned, we flawed, fallen, dysfunctional humans, that one of the things our nature was bad at was power. So we fumbled our way towards a system of checks and balances that included reversibility. Tony Benn's question to anyone in a position of power, how can I get rid of you when the time comes? A fundamental question. when you're engaging with powerful people. How to get rid of those in power and opposition. How to go on challenging those in power. Without those cleansing antiphonals, people in power do terrible things. Even good people do terrible things because power intrinsically corrupts the human complicated animal. This was how Niebuhr summed it up. He said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy essential. It seems to me that we must hold to the pessimistic compromises of flawed democracy against two shimmering delusions that constantly attract human beings down the history. One is the idea of the great leader who will control our sinfulness like an omnipotently benign father, magical messianic thinking, or the idea that there is a perfect formula for society that will finally and forever purge us of our imperfections once we establish it, utopian thinking. And we tend to shudder in our self-management, our institutional management between these theories. Somewhere out there, there's the person or there's the idea that's going to sort this out and calm the white water rapids. And politics shudders between them. But it's the knowledge and understanding of our imperfections itself that saves us from our worst excesses. A fundamental insight here is that we humans are not as free as we think we are. We're determined and driven by factors never in our control, including personal and historical circumstances, all the facts in the universe. I hope you'll forgive me, but the theologian who got it best was Philip Larkin. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They do not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-time hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can and don't have any kids yourself, and he didn't. An important consequence of the realist understanding of human nature is, therefore, the necessity of forgiveness in managing our political and institutional lives, as well as in our personal relations. And the best guide to me here is Hannah Arendt. She saw what tragic creatures we are, blindly and cruelly blundering into and damaging each other. And this is what she wrote about us. Though we don't know what we're doing when we are acting, we have no possibility ever to undo what we have done. Action processes are irreversible. There is no author or maker who can undo what he has done if he does not like it or when the consequences are disastrous. And then she goes on. The possible redemption from the predicament of irreversibility is the faculty of forgiving. Without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victim of its consequences forever. Can you hear what she's saying? Our tragedy is that though we may not know what we are doing when we act, and really deeply in many ways we don't, precisely because of our Larkin-esque background, our actions go on determining the behavior of those they have damaged, and the script drives the action to the next crisis. And since art always imitates life, this is the pattern we see repeated again and again in novels and plays and soap operas. Note her definition of forgiveness here. Being forgiven means, in Arendt's words, being released from the consequences of what we have done. Forgiveness cannot reverse the action, but it can interrupt its consequences. Without forgiveness, the scripted sequence flows on and determines the future, sometimes for centuries. The main application of forgiveness in the political or institutional sphere is the determination not to let the future be driven or destroyed by the sins of the past. And it's almost impossibly hard to do. Let me give you a couple of examples where it kind of succeeded. The Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa looked at that terrible dark history. The actions of the past were owned and admitted, but they were not allowed to determine the future. They were forgiven in the sense that the normal impulse to revenge years of oppression was interrupted. In Arendt's words, they refused to allow themselves to become the victims of its consequences. Political forgiveness gave them agency over their own future, and if they hadn't had it, their own future would have been determined by that terrible past, as is so often the case in history. My second example is the peace process in Northern Ireland. It was not so much a truth and reconciliation process that owned the past, more an attempt to seal the past into the past, put a lid on it so that it wouldn't bleed continuously into the future. Of course, it does leak out a bit, and there are constant little bits of crisis about it, but on the whole, it was the determination to let the past be there, unreconciled in many ways, but with a determination to move into a new and different future. Nietzsche was another philosopher who thought about these matters. He knew how hard forgiveness was and thought it required what he called plastic energy. Here's what he says: in order to determine the extent and thereby the boundary point at which past things must be forgotten, if they are not to become the grave diggers of the present, it's the same theme as Arendt, one has to know the exact extent of the plastic energy of a person. That is, the power to grow uniquely from within, to transform and incorporate the past and the unknown, to heal wounds, to replace what is lost, and to duplicate shattered structures from within. There are people so lacking this energy that they bleed to death as if from a tiny scratch after a single incident, a single pain, and often in particular a single minor injustice. And it seems to me that our social and political culture today, amplified by the constant surveillance of social media, often seems to lack the plastic energy Nietzsche talked about and bleeds to death as if from a tiny scratch after a single incident. Let me give you a couple of examples of that in recent history. During the Rochester by-election in 2014, Emily Thornberry, then Shadow Attorney General, mischievously tweeted a picture of a local house flying the English flag. She was sacked by the then Labour leader Ed Miliband for the sin of contempt for the flag flyer. The leader of the opposition probably acted in the way he did because he was aware of the unforgiving nature of contemporary political culture. You can't get away with what many people wouldn't have thought was much of a mistake, just a wee jokey tactlessness. But what he did fortified a culture in which politicians are risk-averse, less daring, indeed sometimes morally paralyzed, because they're afraid of the invading surveillance that follows them. Another example that goes in the opposite direction, though you may not have heard of it because it happened in Scotland. We are going to be the Hawaii when London declares UDI and becomes part of your independent nation. Last May, after the local elections, Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Scottish Tory party, and lots of people seem to want her down here, was praised for suspending 2 councillors from the party for making racist and sexist comments on Twitter. But 3 months later, she was criticised for reinstating one of them because, as she put it, he wanted to change his behavior and deserved a second chance. Forgiveness stops us imprisoning ourselves in the mistakes of the past and remaining the victim of their consequences forever. As important as that kind of forgiveness to actual incidents and mistakes is that forgiveness helps us manage the necessary failures of the present. And let me try to explain what I mean by that. Politics is a human art. It's not an exact science, although they talk about political science. And like all art, it proceeds on the basis of trial and error. So the courage to fail is an important element in success in politics. And the courage to understand that you must fail in order to succeed. Artists know and practice this. Writers certainly do. They're forever scrapping stuff that didn't work. The delete button or the wastepaper basket are their best friends. Politicians are not allowed to work in this way because the culture makes it impossible for them to admit they got a policy wrong and now plan wisely to change direction. The headlines, government does a U-turn. Well, for God's sake, we all need to do U-turns when we go up blind alleys, as we all do in our lives. But politicians are uniquely criticized if they dare to do it. If we're never allowed to admit we got something wrong, we'll never get anything right, because failure is the mother of success, especially in the moral and in the political life. It's even more difficult in religion, I can tell you, because if you believe your opinions come from God, how can you ever be persuaded to change them? Which is why religion's usually behind the curve in some of the most important moral changes in my lifetime. So here's my third conclusion, and I'm just about done. Given all I've said, it might be easy to paralyze ourselves into inaction. How can we possibly get anything right, say anything right? Let's just stay at home and do nothing. We mustn't be paralyzed by all this. We must accept that we are frail and imperfect, but go on acting in a spirit of what we might call humble confidence or a sense of provisionality, remembering how many times we've had to change our mind in the past. And it should give us a kind of confidence about getting it wrong. So my final question is, how can we capture and live by this attitude that allows us to forgive ourselves and other mistakes and somehow not to be imprisoned by the consequences of actions that we were never entirely sure what we were doing in the first place? I want to change the tone here in my conclusion because this has been heavy stuff. Politics is heavy. The atmosphere in our culture is heavy, very self-critical, very divided, very divisive, and there are demons abroad stalking the land that we thought had been exorcised forever. So I want to change the tone in conclusion. I want to talk about play. A human ecologist called Joseph Meeker, I read years ago, he wrote a very important book during another terrible, massive calamity, the Vietnam War. And in the book, he described the way animals don't push their conclusions quite to the dramatic end that we do. They tend not to fight to death. Once one's beaten, they'll go and savage a bush or something. They will redirect it. Whereas the human animal, the tragic animal, fights to the death over ideas, over territory, over impossibly inconceivable things. And he said that he longed for the human animal to learn how to play again, because he believed that play was in fact the instrument of evolution, this ability to risk things, to make mistakes, to push out on the branch of the tree and maybe fall off, but to get it right in the end. And another American philosopher who comes at the same thing from a different angle is Arthur Danto, and he described the human animal as an ens representans, a being that represents the world back to itself. We can't help doing it. We are the creative animal. We build cathedrals, we compose symphonies, we create politics, we invent democracy. We're always doing this kind of stuff. We can't help it. It flows out of us. And its root is a kind of playfulness, a kind of joyfulness about life itself. And I think that the trouble with a lot of us is that as we get on in life, and as we get on, as it were, ambitiously in life, we lose a lot of that ability to play and discard and try. Children have it. I went on a lovely holiday in Sussex 10 years ago with my London grandchildren and my wee granddaughter Lorna. I took her out for a walk one evening in the summer, and she sang the day she'd had. She repeated incidents. Went to the beach and played in the sand. Gilly didn't like the sheep, and she was completely oblivious to me. She was composing, she was representing the world back to itself. We can do that, but the trouble is we get hammered and made heavy by all the weary things that happen to us. And I just wish we could recover play in religion, but above all in politics. I understand that behind the scenes a lot of politicians actually get on well with each other. I'd just like to see a bit of that playful frivolity. And so I want to leave you with the idea that forgiving can be a kind of play. And that playful people maybe learn to forgive more easily, more lithely, more blithely. So let me end with a tip. I live in Edinburgh near a number of primary schools. And in the winter months, I see the parents trudging to school with their children. And the parents are head down and, they're going to work and they're plodding. The children are skipping. They make a dance of going to school, for God's sake, because they're natural artists. And it seems to me that if we could recover a bit of skipping in our lives, the skipping of enjoyment, the skipping of forgiveness, the skipping of a lighter politics, we'd be healthier, we wouldn't have all these heart attacks and things, and we would create a more joyful country. I know it's a vain hope, but Scotland's full of vain hopes, and I thought I'd bring one to London. So thank you very much.